Welcome to 2023, everybody. And to start the year off right, we're going to dive into the question of historical sources, something that many heathens interact with, debate, and will encounter during the course of their practice. Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Smith, and you are listening to The Wayward Wanderer. The bedrock of any historical study is, without question, the source materials that you are using to understand and explain the period and society that you are investigating. Understanding and working with source materials of all kinds is its own particular discipline that's referred to as historiography. Now, I've gotten into this topic before in the 10th episode of this podcast, but I think this question of source material in particular needs deeper examination, mostly because there seem to be some misconceptions about what is involved in doing source analysis and what sources, particularly primary sources, represent. Primary sources are of particular importance because of how critical certain primary sources, like the Eddas and surviving sagas of Scandinavia, are to the development, construction, and growth of heathenry, heathen philosophy, and heathen spirituality. Now, before I really dive into the meat of what I'm going to tackle, I do want to say up front that I've got some qualification for offering this kind of information as well as analysis. I've recently completed a PhD in economic and social history, which includes some pretty extensive research into not just the specific subjects that I was engaging with, but also into the craft of analyzing source material, constructing a historical argument, and as a result, having an appreciation for what it is historians have to go through when they're doing source analysis. I also spent 2 years while pursuing my PhD teaching in the topic, which included extensive work and specific seminars on how to do historical source analysis. Some of what I'm going to be presenting in this episode is drawn from particularly that pedagogical experience, and also more generally from my broader education and understanding of historiography. Now, one thing I do want to say up front is my particular emphasis is, as I have stated in many other places, modern. However, that doesn't change that I do have some background in the period in the form of a bachelor's in early medieval history, or that even though I don't have specific doctoral level expertise in medieval history, I still do have a solid understanding of what the theories are that influence how historians work, what the different methodological assumptions are, and also, by the way, as part of that historiographic training, we did all receive training in not just how to deal with stuff in the modern context, but also stuff in pre-modern contexts, including using things like archaeological research and linguistic investigation. My modern emphasis has also informed the level of respect I have for the dedicated scholars of the Nordic peoples who have gone the distance to do that, because I know just from doing more recent history how difficult it is for historians who have access to source materials to do the work, and can only begin to imagine how difficult it is for people who have a much smaller selection of written source material, all of which is absolutely biased in lots of different ways, and on top of that, archaeology and outside source material. What I'm going to do with this episode to explain how source analysis is done is I'm going to first get into one particular example of academic writing that has been pretty roundly and justifiably criticized by members of multiple social scientific fields, in part because of the handling of source materials. I am talking, of course, about Jared Diamond. After getting into that particular example, I'm going to then get into what historical sources are. Before then getting into the challenges of conducting historical research, the source materials that are actually available and their limitations, and finally, what this means for heathen practitioners working in the present day. Before I really dive in, as always, I'd like to thank all of my patrons for making this possible and helping to support my work. If you're interested in lending a hand, please head on over to patreon.com/waywardwanderer. $5 a month, one flat fee, gets you advanced access to all podcast episodes, monthly live Q&A sessions with me, and hopefully more to come in the new year. So head on over to patreon.com/waywardwanderer. $5 a month, which is less than a cup of coffee and probably about half the price of a beer in San Francisco, will get you all those benefits and more. And now, with that shameless plug all nice and finished up, I'm going to dive into the episode, starting with Jared Diamond. Jared Diamond, for those who may not be as familiar with him, is a geographer and, according to him, environmental historian who, at time of recording, and last I checked, is still at UCLA. Easily his most well-known work in the eyes of the public is Guns, Germs, and Steel, a book that was released in 1997 and was subsequently adapted around 8 years later as a documentary series by the National Geographic Society. Guns, Germs, and Steel, according to Diamond, sets out to answer the question about why some societies became more affluent while others did not. In other words, why do we have things like colonialism and global inequalities and different levels of economic development in different parts of the world? He claims that this was largely due to specific geographic factors that made it easier for agriculture to develop and spread within Eurasia than in every other continent. The short version of that argument is because Eurasia, which is Europe and Asia taken as one, has most of its major populated areas located within more or less the same latitudes, which, according to Diamond, made it easier for the same sets of crops and animal domesticates to spread between different civilizations and become adopted by different societies within the region. In short, the reason why Europe ended up imperializing the rest of the world, according to Diamond, is because of some accidents of prehistory that meant that European societies were in a good place to take advantage of these technologies and develop deep, sophisticated understanding of what they offered. He also claims this latitudinal analysis is why certain technologies like gunpowder and steel making spread more easily between these societies and did not spread to other ones. He also extends this argument to things like systems of writing and other similar social and technological developments that have had profound impacts on the world and history. Now, I'm sure for anyone who's listening along, there's an element of this that maybe sounds a bit persuasive, and there's also probably an element of this that has you going, so wait, this was all just inevitable and an accident of history, and that's all there is to it. And guess what? Y'all would both be right. There's been a lot of criticisms leveled against Jared Diamond, and I've included a few in the show description so you can dig more into some of the specific objections raised. Before you go to the really obvious problem with this, I do want to point out that Diamond goes out of his way to argue that these accidents of history are not reflections of any kind of inherent superiority of European peoples, but were due to basically chance that was beyond much of their control. So, he does go out of his way to say, I'm not being racist about this, which kind of rings a little bit hollow when you spend 5 minutes looking at the history of similar theories and see that a similar kind of geographic determinism tends to show up in lots of race science and racist history. One particular aspect I would like to zero in on of Jared Diamond's work, and this is a critique that many people have made, not just myself, is how he treats primary sources. Now, it is important to say up front that Jared Diamond's original education up to the doctoral level was in physiology. Specifically, he did something around like gallbladder membranes or something like that. This is important because Diamond's STEM-influenced research methods show through very strongly, particularly from the biological sciences. In those fields, the results of experimental data are the closest you get to something like primary sources. They also, because they are repeatable under controlled circumstances, at least they are if you're doing good science, generally treated as the direct data that is produced by the experiment and analyzed by the researcher. This, unfortunately, is not true of historical primary sources, but this doesn't stop Jared Diamond from engaging in some really sloppy work with the primary source material that he draws on, such as, for example, when he was describing the conquest of the Inca and Aztec societies by Spanish conquistadors, Diamond takes the accounts of the conquistadors at face value. This is something that historians of the Americas, and when we're talking this particular period, you're talking pre-Columbian and early colonization specialists, caution very strongly against in this case. And that's because they know, based on things like archaeology and other available source material, that many of these conquistadors frequently exaggerated the scope and power of the armies that they fought against. They also tended to heavily emphasize the importance of themselves and their Spanish troops over that of their far more numerous, in the case of the Aztecs, indigenous allies, or other factors such as a plague that broke out throughout the Incan Empire prior to Pizarro's invasion. For historians of this period, claims like the first battle between Pizarro and his men against the Inca forces involved a small band of 180 men and 37 horses, were successful in overcoming, according to Pizarro, an army of 100,000 Inca warriors. And this, by the way, is far from the only example of such kind of exaggeration and misrepresentation coming from these different conquistadors, who, it must be said, were writing for their contemporaries. And part of that included exaggerating the significance of their victories, the power of the enemies against them, and all kinds of other stuff, so that when these accounts got back to Spain or to other parts of the growing Spanish Empire, it'd be a great way to establish fame, credibility, and power within this new society. This also had the practical goal of helping protect these conquistadors against the possibility of royal reprisal, since many of these expeditions, particularly Cortez's expedition into Mexico, were not actually sanctioned by Spanish authorities and were definitely happening in a bit of a quasi-legal sort of questionable state. Diamond, instead of engaging in this kind of cross-examination, takes this at face value and uses it to substantiate his claims about the significant differences and the massive technological and biological advantages offered to European civilization over the peoples of the Americas. Jared Diamond is also not the only individual or academic who has engaged in this mistake. Modern American society, as well as, at least from what I saw living in Europe, tends to treat things like primary sources in a really similar fashion to Jared Diamond. And that's often because the particular skills, techniques, and discipline of doing source analysis is something that one only really learns if you are actively pursuing studies in history. And even then, you only really learn the basics at the bachelor's level and don't get into the higher level concepts and details that really go into this until you start doing lots of graduate study. One particular example of this mentality were the, for lack of a better way to put it, statue controversies that broke out throughout the United States, starting in around, say, 2017 and reaching something of a fever pitch during the George Floyd uprising of 2020. To put it briefly for people who are not familiar, there are, throughout the American South, many monuments that have been raised celebrating important figures in the Confederate States of America. The side of the American Civil War that consisted of the states who seceded to protect the states' rights to own slaves. And by the way, not going to argue about this. It was about slavery. The consensus of the field of American Civil War studies is it was about slavery. Everything about the Civil War goes back to and flows from slavery. And the founders of the Confederacy were quite frank in their documents and ordinances of secession, which often in the first or second clause would go to preserve the peculiar institutions of the South. I am not arguing about this point. Die mad about it. But anyway, without running down that particular rabbit hole much further, these statues were, in the eyes of people defending them, described as important historical artifacts that were raised by the peoples of the South to celebrate their unique history and culture. What this, of course, conveniently left out is most of these statues didn't go up until the 1890s with the establishment of Jim Crow, and there was something of a second burst when the civil rights movement was really kicking off in the 50s and 60s. So to say that these statues are historical artifacts is true, but they're not historical artifacts of the Civil War or Southern history and culture generally. They're products specifically of organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and lots of other similar organizations, and were raised as part of cementing the new Jim Crow regime in the American South. They certainly are artifacts of history, but not the history their defenders claim they represent. This is not to say that all examples of people treating primary sources at face value and not engaging in serious internal criticism of source documents are all coming from the same place or all have the same kinds of motivation. What it is, however, saying is that these are ideas and concepts that are out there in the wild. And it certainly would be fair to say that since heathenry sits downstream from a lot of what's in modern society, this stuff also filters into how heathens talk about primary sources and interact with them. This is now where we get into what kind of historical sources exist. Within the field of history, there are two broad categories of source materials. Primary sources, which I have referred to already, but have not properly defined yet, and secondary sources. Primary sources are materials that were produced by peoples who were present for and often witnesses to the historical events described in the materials in question. This means primary sources can be a whole range of different materials, like photographs, diaries, chronicles, official reports, tax records, and all kinds of other stuff. Like what I've just listed off is only scratching the surface of what counts as a primary source. Everything from runic graffiti inside the Hagia Sophia in what is now modern-day Istanbul to the Heimskringla and runestones are all primary sources. Well, maybe the second one not quite, but I'll get into that in a little bit. Next are secondary sources, which are materials that are produced after the fact, often, though not always, by scholars and academics, and often incorporate other analysis, reflections, and additional materials. Now, sometimes these secondary sources are primary sources in their own right, but in very particular circumstances. For example, a history book from Montgomery, Alabama, that was published in 1970 is not a primary source for describing the events that are contained within the text. It is, however, absolutely a primary source if you're talking about education in Alabama in the 1970s. One thing both kinds of sources have in common is they are produced by human beings, so therefore they are subject to the biases and assumptions of the individual producing them, as well as the time and place that they exist within. Neither source should be taken as fully authoritative or unimpeachable, and frequently responsible historians will be very careful to couch what they describe in their research in terms of the available context, as well as the limitations of what the source material provides. Either way, the challenges that face historians, regardless of whether you're talking primary or secondary sources, are considerable. I'm going to quote now from John Tosh's The Pursuit of History, a text that was the historiography text for my master's level studies in historiography. To quote from Tosh, "For the primary sources are not an open book, offering instant answers. They may not be what they seem to be. They may signify very much more than is immediately apparent. They may be couched in obscure and antiquated forms that are meaningless to the untutored eye. Before the historian can properly assess the significance of a document, he or she needs to find out when and why it came into being. This requires the application of both supporting knowledge and skeptical intelligence. Records, it has been said, like the little children of long ago, only speak when they are spoken to, and they will not talk to strangers. Nor, it might be added, will they be very forthcoming to anyone in a tearing hurry. Even for the experienced historian with green fingers, research in the primary sources is time-consuming. For the novice, it can be painfully slow." Tosh then proceeds to describe what he defines as external and internal criticism. External criticism, according to Tosh, is a historian determining whether or not the document is what it purports to be. This is pretty critical because, it is important to be able to determine, is this medieval chronicle actually the real thing, or is it potentially an elaborate fabrication, or something that was produced well after the period that it is describing? One particularly potent example of why this is necessary is the so-called Book of Veles, a document that purports to describe the religion and history of the pre-Christian Slavic peoples. Linguistic analysis has determined that even though the book purports to describe events as far back as the 7th century BC up to the 9th century AD, that it was most likely produced at some point during the 1940s and 50s. What makes the forgery especially apparent is that different editions of the Book of Veles and purported translations of it have divergent text. And I'm not just talking differences of translation, I'm talking differences in terms of passages and content. The next step is what Tosh refers to as internal criticism, which is reading the biases, the assumptions, and what you know about the production and origin of the primary source in question. This includes really obvious things like who wrote it, if that knowledge is available, when was it produced, and what material was used to produce it, as well as some really, really gritty details like how was the manuscript made, where was it found, when was it found, and what is present within the material that reveals further information about both what is present and what is not. Primary sources, as I've said before, and will probably repeat several times in this episode, are products of their time, written for peoples who were living in those times and places. They were not produced with the expectation, at least not usually, of people from the future, from different societies and different social contexts, reading them and using them to determine things about their history. This also raises the question of reliability. To quote again from Tosh, "Once historians have been immersed in the sources of their period and have mastered its characteristic turns of phrase and the appropriate technical vocabulary, questions of meaning tend to worry them less often. But the content of a document prompts a further, much more insistent question. Is it reliable? No source can be used for historical reconstruction until some estimate of its standing as historical evidence has been made." A good example of how historians do this is the previous example I gave of the accounts of conquistadors in the Americas, which have been cross-examined, compared against other source material like archaeology and accounts from indigenous societies that survive to the present day, as well as other materials to determine how reliable are these texts. And in the case of quite a few of these conquistador accounts, it was determined, well, only somewhat, and to a limited degree, as long as we keep in mind the massive biases and agendas behind the people who produced those materials. This, by the way, is true of every time period and every part of the world when you're doing history. Any and every primary source has to be assessed based on its reliability. It has to be assessed based on how it's interacting with its historical context. It has to be assessed based on what are the limitations that are shown by a source's biases and access to information. There is then also what theorist Edward Said refers to as the archive problem, which is essentially that not only do you have the biases of the primary sources and the biases that exist within scholarship and are reproduced by scholars, but also the biases that are unconsciously reproduced simply because of the existing body of literature and known primary sources that are investigated by historians and other scholars. Not only are primary sources biased, the means by which they are stored, cataloged, and organized can also reproduce certain biases, even if those biases are as simple as what an organization considered to be more or less important for achieving their goals, and was more or less worthy of preservation as a result. In short, you can't really take primary sources or historical sources at face value and just say, well, okay, we know about these biases and their context and stuff, but clearly they're representing something fairly accurately. Primary source material is not directly collected data using repeatable and verifiable methods. It is a product of human hands and human societies, and often had at least some particular goal assumptions or structural blinders, if you will, going into their creation. This brings me to the challenges that come with doing historical research, and what comes with wrestling with primary sources, along with the limitations that historians have to contend with. Now, the two examples I'm going to get into are ones that are much more modern, but this is deliberate. The reason why is both because in one case, it is stuff that is from my personal experience that I can speak to from my own peer-reviewed published research, and the other is coming from a fairly modern, but still not totally modern subject and set of sources dealing with a fairly famous individual. And I'm going to get into that one first. For those who spend a significant amount of time on the more historically focused ends of YouTube, there's a particular channel that I enjoy that does a good job in terms of the history they get into, as well as how they present the arguments, called Atunche Films. They do a lot of different stuff that depends on the creator's interests, and one particular area of interest for that channel is the American Civil War. His Checkmate Lincolnites series is a particularly well-known example of the kind of historical research he does, and I strongly encourage people to check that one out. It is both entertaining YouTube material as well as informative for getting into some misconceptions around the causes of the American Civil War. There is one video that the channel has released in conjunction with this, which I have linked in the episode description, that talks about what we know and don't know about Confederate General Thomas Stonewall Jackson. For those who are not Americans or massive history nerds, Jackson is one of the most celebrated commanders of the American Civil War. He is often held up in sort of legendary status as being a military genius without peer. And while that is a somewhat exaggerated reputation, he was one of the more talented tactical commanders on either side of the conflict. What Atunche Films gets into in their video on this subject is, even though this man is extremely well known, was a major historical figure who had significant impact on the time and place and events that he was operating in, we really actually don't know very much about this guy. This is, according to the video, because we don't have very much in the way of reliable source materials for describing Thomas Jackson the man. Sure, we know broad strokes about his life, but we don't know anything much about him beyond things like his wife's diaries, a memoir that she wrote decades after his death, and some different newspaper reporting, some of which we know was not based on any kind of eyewitness accounts or observations. One of the most famous and seemingly well-known things about him, his nickname Stonewall, is even something that has at least 3 different, equally plausible, some actually more plausible than others, explanations for where that nickname came from, ranging from the often referred to quote of a Confederate general supposedly saying, "Look there, to Jackson's brigade, they stand like a stone wall," a quote which comes to us from northern newspapers and not actually from things like, say, accounts of the general who supposedly said it or anybody else who was at the Battle of First Bull Run. I cannot stress enough, this is a guy whose campaigns are still studied in military academies all over the world, has been lionized for generations as a hero of the Confederate cause, and is probably one of the most famous historical Americans out there. And yet, because we don't have very much in the way of reliable, particularly first-hand primary source documents describing this man or giving us an insight into who he was, there's a lot we just don't know about Thomas Jackson. And he died 160 some odd years ago, in a society that had cheap paper, widespread literacy, mass newspapers, telegraphs, and early photography for documenting and transmitting information. We even have the memoirs and accounts of other Confederate generals, some of which contradict stories about Thomas Jackson. It is worth mentioning that these memoirs should be taken with a grain of salt, at least the ones that were written by other general officers. And this is because, like many other examples of military memoirs written by commanders throughout history, there is a certain tendency of the authors to try to basically put their actions in the best light possible, absolve themselves of responsibility where they can. And in the case of people like George McClellan, for example, who faced a defeat, or like, say, the entire Confederate flag officer corps saw the war lost and were soundly defeated, it makes sense that you're going to want to spin things. And this is far from the only example of that. Wehrmacht memoirs from the Second World War for German military officials also run into similar problems and tendencies, which gives rise to this whole notion of the Red Army only won by drowning the German military under waves of bodies. Whether you're a Nazi or a Confederate, it does sound better to say we lost because there were just so many of them, and not to say, well, part of why we lost is because we legitimately blew it. Point is, this is talking about a very well-known figure who lived within the last 200 years in a time period where there was mass media and ease of record keeping. I'm going to jump now up to my particular research that I did for my thesis, which deals with the development of financial instruments and practices during the oil shocks of the 1970s, a topic which is totally irrelevant, I'm sure, to anything that is going on right now. Most of my research was done at banks, at the Bank of England, and at other similar regulatory authorities who were supervising these different banks and financial institutions during the period I was studying. Now, you would think, because this is the 1970s, by now computer technology is starting to become an actual thing and in use within finance. Telephones, television, radio, and all kinds of other means of easy mass production, reprinting, and distribution of material is at people's fingertips. You would think the biggest problem that would have been facing me was having too much to go through. And this is partly true. I've got something like 50,000 pages of scanned primary source archival materials sitting on my hard drive, and I guarantee I have not read most of it in depth, partly because a significant chunk of it's not relevant to my research, but also because there's just a lot of it. However, another part of the problem was not having the source materials that I needed. And this wasn't just because there were banks and institutions that wouldn't let me do research with them. This was often because the banks themselves were not recording the data that was related to what I was investigating in a way that was accessible or cataloged in a usable fashion. One part of my research dealt with changes in international lending practices, and instead of using materials from a major player in global finance like Barclays Bank, I ended up using material from the Bank of Scotland. And the reason why I ended up using the Bank of Scotland, which at the time was basically a regional concern with limited international engagement, was because their materials and their documentation of the changes in their lending practices was much more systematic, thorough, and most importantly, centralized and accessible than was the case for Barclays, who had significant international commitments during that period prior to and following the time when I was conducting these studies. That's before I even get into the weirdness that was investigating a specific type of financial instrument called a derivative, which was somewhat new, at least the ones I was looking at anyway, and extremely poorly documented. In fact, many of the derivatives that I was dealing with, which are referred to by very different names from what they were referred to during that period, weren't even really consistently recorded by the banks as being their own unique activity. One particular contract, which is known today as a swap, was often bundled into other interbank transactions and lending without any, differentiation between what these loans are for and what kind of contracts are securing them. And that, by the way, is just from the stuff I knew about and had access to. Most major historical archives and archivists will confess, particularly when you're talking more modern institutions like businesses and banks, that they sometimes may only have a general idea of what they have in their archives, in part because whoever it was that first cataloged and stored it may not have necessarily given the most precise information, used the most consistent way of documenting it, or been aware of what it was they were flagging and setting aside. One archive that I conducted research with, for example, proved to have far more useful materials in the personal papers of people who had previously worked at that particular regulatory agency than in any of the subject-specific files from that time period. And as you can imagine, when you're sorting through something like personal papers, there are some things in there that are interesting and really fascinating and useful. And then there's lots of stuff like, oh yes, I got your missive and I will be more than happy to join you for the society dinner at blah, blah, blah. Trust me, a lot of I will be joining you for the society dinner at blah, blah, blah kind of stuff was in there. This is now where I'm going to get into early medieval sources and what generally we have available when we're talking primary source materials from what is often known as the Viking Age that describe the Nordic peoples. These consist of archaeology, the handful of contemporaneous primary sources that exist, the Poetic Edda, and the various sagas. Each of these have their own problems and limitations. Archaeology, for example, provides a lot of excellent physical evidence of certain phenomena, such as, for example, as Neil Price has argued in his book Children of Ash and Elm, the pervasiveness of the system of thrall enslavement that existed within Nordic society, as well as its dramatic increase in scope and scale over the course of the period. What archaeological sources don't do, however, is they don't really say the why of why this was done. One good example of this from a slightly earlier period are sword burials that are found in several parts of Germany and Austria that were in sort of borderlands regions between the Roman Empire and the peoples who lay beyond within Central Europe. The sword burials I'm referring to are great heaps of swords that are piled up, sometimes broken or shattered, and then buried. It is speculated by historians and archaeologists that this may have been a form of religious ritual, that by sacrificing and breaking these weapons, they were engaging in a great spiritual and socially significant act of some kind or another. This, by the way, as I said, is speculation, because we don't have any primary sources that were made by the Germanic peoples of that region describing why they did this, or what their reasons were for taking perfectly good iron blades, breaking them, and burying them. Similar to this are the historical primary sources, like the accounts of Ibn Fadlan and Adam of Bremen, describing the Nordic peoples that they encountered. These are sources that were produced by people that were outside of the societies they were describing. This means there was lots of information, assumptions, ideas, and perspectives held by the peoples they were describing that the authors did not have sufficient knowledge of, or simply didn't understand because they were not of the societies in question. There are certainly examples of exaggerations that exist within these sources, such as, for example, Adam of Bremen's famous claim of the temple at Uppsala being roofed in gold and decorated in silver and all kinds of other precious metals. A claim that, while certainly possible, it's not like people didn't like putting some bling onto their religious objects back in that particular society, is not very likely simply because of the great expense, labor, resourcing, as well as, generally unforgiving weather of that part of the world that would make short work of a gold shod roof. These exaggerations bear similarities to other missionary accounts, not just from that period, but from later and earlier periods, where, as historians have argued, there is a consistent tendency of these authors to exaggerate certain details about the societies being converted to make the accomplishment of bringing them to Christianity sound even more impressive than it was. Not unlike conquistadors lying about the size of enemy armies. There is also the problem of that some of these sources, like, say, the account of Gregory of Tours or that of the Venerable Bede, were not written by people that were witnesses to what they were describing, but were documented, often after the fact, by somebody who was not actually there for any of the things that they are describing. One good example of this from Gregory of Tours, who is quite useful for understanding the Merovingian Frankish regime, is his description of a group of pirates who he calls Danes, who engaged in some raiding on the northern shores of the kingdom. Raiding which Gregory was not a witness to. Gregory, by his own account, is describing based on what other people have said. And let's be honest, for anyone who's studied the history of piracy, there is a long and consistent tendency, not just in this time period, but around the world, of peoples on the receiving end of banditry or piracy to misidentify or conflate who the raiders were depending on their own presumptions and preconceptions. It is possible those raiders were Danes, but it is also quite possible, based on who else was running around in the period and who else was engaging in similar activities, that they could have been Frisians, they could have been Anglo-Saxons, they could have even been renegade Franks who had decided to take up a little bit of piracy as a way of supplementing their income. Just because Gregory of Tours, who again was not there for this particular event, says they were Danes, doesn't necessarily mean they were actually Danes. This, by the way, is not a unique problem to Gregory of Tours. Many early medieval, high medieval, and late medieval primary sources would, in other time periods and in other contexts, be considered secondary sources, such as, for example, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which was largely compiled based on accounts, prior records, and includes a little bit, though not too much, in the way of commentary by the people who are putting it together. The reason why, in this case, sources like Gregory of Tours and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle are called primary sources is because they're the only written sources we have, or are of the handful that actually survive from the period itself. This brings me to the Poetic Edda, one of the central texts for modern heathenry, precisely because it is one of the only probably primary sources that was most likely produced by, if not pre-conversion peoples, at least non-Christian Icelanders. Maybe. You'll notice there's lots of maybes and supposition that's going on in that sentence there. And the reason why is we don't actually know very much about who wrote the Poetic Edda, or rather, who compiled it. The collection itself was found on a farm in Iceland at some point during the 1200s at some point. The existence of the Poetic or Elder Edda, as it was sometimes referred to, was speculated by antiquarians and scholars not just in Iceland, but throughout Scandinavia, based on Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, which in several places seems to be referring to older material, much in a similar way to how the Heimskringla clearly refers to older sagas that have since been lost. The collection was not actually found until 1643, when it came into the possession of one Brynjolfur Sveinsson, the Bishop of Skalholt in Iceland. It was then passed on to the King of Denmark, who was at the time the overlord of both Iceland and Norway, at which point it became known as the Codex Regius, the King's Codex. We don't know who compiled this document or why. One can deduce, based on the material that it was produced on, as well as the fact that it's a written document likely produced in the early 1200s, that the compiler was somebody who knew how to read and write, so therefore was educated, and had access to significant resources because they were able to afford all the necessary parchment as well as labor for producing this body of work. You could almost compare it to the Dead Sea Scrolls, in that it seems to have been something that was carefully preserved, but who preserved it and why is something of a mystery. What further supports that the compiler was most likely, if not of the Icelandic gentry themselves, at least supported and sustained by them, is there is a certain aristocratic bias in terms of the material and what it is describing, where clearly in lots of places the Poetic Edda is being written from the perspective of somebody who would have been part of the warrior elite, or at least the otherwise landed and well-to-do of the Icelandic Commonwealth, or wherever else it was they were from in Scandinavia. I do also want to stress the great expense that would have been involved in producing this thing, and you can see it in one of the links below, that the text itself is not arranged in the nice, neat, clearly delineated verse structures that you see in modern translations. Instead, every single inch of page space is crammed with writing. This was not unusual for manuscripts of this time period because, again, making parchment requires vellum. Vellum comes from baby sheep. Now think about how much in terms of material that you're going to get from one baby sheep's skin and multiply that by the number of pages you need to make a book like the Poetic Edda. And you get an idea of both cost as well as why the people compiling it were being so, one could say, efficient with their space. What this likely means, though again, this is supposition based on the available evidence, this is not something that has been determined as fact, is that what the Poetic Edda represents is a perspective on the spirituality of the Nordic peoples that likely was an elite perspective, and not necessarily the same perspective that would have been shared by people that would have been, say, free farmers or landless laborers or people who were under thraldom. This doesn't mean, therefore, the source should be discounted, but rather it should be taken within that context. And, for example, documents like the Rigsthula should probably be interrogated a bit more closely as to why they leave out the ubiquitous Ting assemblies in their descriptions of the class society contained therein, or its insistence that all of the classes described were hereditary and had been since time immemorial. Regardless of how you interpret the Rigsthula, it certainly is not the first or the last time that people used religion as a way of propping up existing social structures and justifying societal norms. Even though, as we can see in the case of the Rigs Thula, it may not have been a completely honest representation of what life was really like for the peoples described within. This brings me to the sagas, most of which were first recorded during the 1200s, about the same time that Snorri was writing his Prose Edda, which, in Snorri's own words, was explicitly written to preserve the Icelandic forms of poetry and the necessary source material to do it properly. While it is somewhat speculative as to who compiled the Poetic Edda and why, there's far less question when it comes to the sagas that first begin being documented in the 1200s. Now, many of these likely, and in some cases probably were, first composed as part of the older skaldic oral tradition well before documentation. But the decision for them to be documented at a point that was more or less 200 years after Christianization was effectively in place, and the crowned heads of the Nordic kingdoms had all sworn to the cross. So there is a little bit of, you could say, telephone game. How much of this is really a direct representation of what went before, and how much of this is being filtered through the assumptions and the biases, as well as to please the assumptions and the biases of the people commissioning these works. We know from this period that this was not the only such attempt to codify and write down such literature by European feudal elites. This is when other similar works, like the Nibelungenlied, which becomes a key source in Wagner's Der Rings des Nibelungen, better known as the Ring Cycle, and is shortly after the Cantar de Mio Cid, the epic poem describing the Spanish warrior El Cid, was first written down. There was also quite a bit of myth-making and glorifying of past history that was going on with lots of other European monarchs and nobles of the same period, quite a few of whom had reached back to the past as a source of inspiration. To give some very broad strokes, because there's absolutely folks who are much better versed on the particulars of this time period, part of what's going on here is aristocrats looking to create entertainment for themselves, because, this is way pre-Netflix days. And there's also an element of propaganda and glorification that's going on here. Having glorious ancestors, mighty heroes, and particularly when we're talking the Christian nobility of Nordic Scandinavia, tales of the martial prowess of their pre-Christian ancestors running around was a good way to go, hey, look at me. I am an absolute badass. I am from a family of badasses who's done all kinds of amazing stuff, and we beat those guys back in the day. Now, I'm sure there's elements of truth within these sagas, and they certainly have some value. But they also have to be read within this context of Scandinavian nobles keeping up with the Joneses. A pressure they would have especially acutely felt coming from realms that were poor, generally not blessed with lots of arable land in the way, say, France was. And France, by the way, was the center of the medieval aristocratic world at this time. If the court of the French kings could be seen as the equivalent of being just down the way from Broadway, culturally and politically, then the Nordic kingdoms were kind of a bit more like the equivalent of the backcountry well-to-do types that everybody calls hicks when they aren't around. And also probably sometimes to their face. What I'm getting at is there's definitely a lot of motive to want to play up certain aspects of these stories and sagas that conform to what's going to look best to this particular audience and to their neighbors. Now, certainly, there's quite a few places where there's stuff that probably has some validity, makes its way through, or got preserved. But let's keep in mind again, this is stuff that was produced as part of a sort of deliberate project of these elites. This wasn't something that was done as sort of just benign interest in heritage or historical preservation or something like that. And so we have to read these with a careful eye towards what's present, with a definite eye towards the strong aristocratic bias and sensibilities that's going into this, as well as what their expectations would have been. This doesn't mean they should be discarded wholesale, but it also means they may not be as authoritative as folks would like them to be. And that, by the way, is okay. All historical sources are ultimately snapshots of specific moments of time, of specific instances and events. And while we can draw conclusions and make analysis and arguments based on this, we have to remember that what is present in these sources is what's present in those sources, is a product of their time, and represents what the person or persons responsible for their documentations wanted other people to see. They give us trends, they give us ideas, they give us material that when combined with things like archaeology and primary sources helps to start put the puzzle together. But let's be honest with ourselves, this is a very incomplete puzzle. And whatever it is that is present in these source materials, as well as how they're represented, is ultimately an imperfect product of their time. We can, and heathens do, use them as a foundation for developing modern practice. But when we're doing so, we need to be clear, regardless of the method and approach to your heathenry, that what you are doing is developing an interpretation based on these materials. And no matter how founded your interpretation is in evidence, the interpretation itself is still a product of modern methods, modern research, and modern access to this particular range of source materials. Well-meaning people can disagree and arrive at different conclusions, regardless of whether or not you may feel that difference of opinion is twisting history. If anything, nothing twists history more than taking historical sources at face value, or using historical sources to draw overly broad conclusions. And with that, I'm going to wrap up this episode. Thank you for bearing with me for the length of this whole thing. It's definitely got a lot of crunchy bits and moving parts going on. There's definitely a lot more for talking about history, the way different groups use history, the way fascists distort or actively fabricate history, that really, if I was going to get into all that, we'd be here all night. So, those are topics I will definitely be visiting in the future, but for now, let's wrap this up here. If you enjoyed this episode and my other work, please head on over to patreon.com/waywardwanderer. $5 a month gets you once a month live Q&A sessions, early access to podcast episodes, and more. So thank you again to my patrons, and thank you to everyone for listening. This has been Ryan Smith at The Wayward Wanderer.